you might not know. So maybe first I was thinking to go with the knowledge of the audience. So like who have heard of let's say Axie Infinity maybe? Yeah, okay. Bitcoin, I suppose, yes. Ethereum, I suppose, yes. What about Dark Forest? Yeah, okay. So it's kind of, so Axie Infinity, I will start because I see some people in the audience not knowing. It's one of the games that breaks through to some extent, and in Axie Infinity, maybe before I just a bit about myself. So I've been building like a studio called Interplay, and it's basically open source game studio. So every game we make is open source, and we've been working since 2017 or even earlier actually, and kind of exploring what you can do on chain. And that's why I wanted to bring what is Axie Infinity, because what Interplay has been exploring is different from Axie Infinity. But yeah, and also as a studio we build tools. Some are actually quite popular, so Adapt Deploy is used across the industry to deploy smart contract on Ethereum. But yeah, basically the main focus is games. And today I want to talk about what I call natural composability. And this diagram basically explains what it is, but I'm going to explain the diagram. It's kind of the topic. And going back to Axie Infinity, and what I wanted to say is that in Axie Infinity, they use the blockchain, but very lightly. It's almost like the thing could run without blockchain, and nobody would even know. It's because they only use the blockchain for the asset. But the game runs on the server like traditionally. So I think what it enables is people to trade the asset, but the game is not affected at all by the blockchain. There is no need for the blockchain to do itself, and they don't actually. If they were using the blockchain, they would have lots of issues, because when you run the game without server, you can't say, oh, actually you are not allowed to do that. And Axie Infinity actually have issue with bots, because their game is quite simple and anybody could write a bot, but they have mechanism to detect kind of bots, but it's all centralized. And on-chain games take a different optic. They say, let's build the logic on-chain. And so it means it's a smart contract on Ethereum, and it means nobody is in control. And so it means you can't say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. So it means you need to design your game regarding bots, and it means also a very important concept is the concept of Sybil resistance, or Sybil, which is the fact that if you give 1,000 tokens in the game to play, then I can just create 1 million accounts or more, and then I have that much token. So you need to have a mechanism at play which prevents you from doing that. And so actually the only solution, and the solution I use in all my games, is the fact that you deposit money in the game, and you can lose it by playing the game. And that prevents Sybil, because okay, someone can create 1 million of this thing, but they are depositing every time this amount of money. And so yeah, and autonomous world is kind of extending that concept. In some way, for me, that was kind of the idea behind on-chain game, and I think there is also on-chain games that don't care about Sybil. They just want the game to run on smart contracts, so it's visible to anyone, but then they don't mind bots taking over this kind of thing. So I think Dark Forest is a bit of an example where it's just an on-chain game. You could probably run on a server, but it runs on the blockchain, making it fair and clear. And other games, I think the funny thing about these games, they seem new, like Axie Infinity was new kind of at the time, and then the on-chain game feel like a renew thing. But if you look back at the history, actually the first game using blockchain was Enterprise, which was also a game fully decentralized, without any control. And actually it's funny that we had to wait further to see another example. So the other example here is Conquest, which is a game of mine. The development started in 2020, but it really got launched as a fully permissionless game in 2022, and so the two properties that are interesting is permissionlessness and persistence. and for me, this kind of what define autonomous world are. The fact that anybody can join, so means bots, means anyone. And persistent means every data that the game produces is accessible to anyone. And that's what allows other kind of property, which is autonomy, what we call autonomous world. The autonomy actually rely on this thing. And they all rely on permissionless API. So when you make your game fully on chain, there is no server, no API key to request. You can do anything on it. And what I'm talking here is actually something that already exists. So I mentioned already Dark Forest, Conquest, and there is also Mitreum. And you can also see in DeFi, you might be more familiar with DeFi. So there is Uniswap, for example, which you could, so they launched started with V2, they started to, you can provide liquidity, but in return they give you a token that represents your liquidity. And that was interesting because then the token was already a standard, so people could easily build upon. And what happened is that people build what they call liquidity pool incentive, like liquidity incentive, to push people to, because one issue in this network is that you need the liquidity for your token, and that one way to do that is to use a open API of permissionless an open API of Uniswap to do that. But now for games, I think it's even more interesting, and so we see that in Dark Forest there is a night market plugin which is made completely independently of the initial game, and it's just a smart contract that let people. So in Dark Forest, there's this idea of you have hidden information about the planet that you discover in the world, and with this plugin you can sell that information. So they, for example, they know there is this planet which has a lot of resources. They can sell the information without revealing it until the purchase is made, and for the purchaser, knowing that you will get the information. And you can even do things like, I want to know the planet if there is a percentage of resources, for example. So they can't sell information that are not interesting, for example. So, and this is allowed with a very interesting technology like zero knowledge proof, and so on its own there is a very interesting technical element, but also a very interesting gameplay element. In Conquest, so the initial game was just by like staking money on planet using this, and then when you stake money on the planet, then you produce spaceships, and you can send these spaceships to attack other players. So it's really basically a game of war. But what happens when you have marketplaces? So again, another smart contract, independent of the game, say, okay, you can actually sell your spaceships. And so what happened is that there is a player who came in the game, they never attacked anyone, nobody attacked them, and they made money out of the game just by selling their spaceships. And there is, in Conquest as well, you have this concept of on-chain treaties. So a bit like if you play Civilization, you can actually make agreement about what you want from the other, etc. And you can combine that with marketplaces, and you can have like a merchant alliance, for example. And so all of this done without permission, without API key, nothing like that. So that's kind of the core of this. And so I think, I don't know if I mentioned it clearly, but the idea is that these games, they are immutable. So the rules are made, and that's why you can build a marketplace, because if it was changeable, someone could just change the rule and your marketplace would break down. But now the question is, so that was what is natural composability, and that kind of the topic is how can, so the idea that you can actually make the world change, but you actually keep the rule as they were. And so the idea, I mean, there is a few solutions that come to mind. You might say, oh, let's upgrade the game. And so in that case, of course, it's not immutable anymore. But maybe you might want to ask, why does it matter? So why it matters is because if you have an upgrade, then you have someone deciding who is upgrading. And either the rules are part of the game, which is a game of like political maneuver, and I guess that's fine, but in many cases you want your game to be isolated from any of that, because you are interested in another aspect of gameplay. And here, this will let a certain set of players take control of this rule and potentially break the expansion that were built. So it's not really an option we can have. So the conclusion is really that ultimately any kind of governance that you build upon, like that are outside of the game, are actually part of the game, because people will use that. I mean, if you know, if you have experienced DeFi and crypto, you know that if things can happen, they will happen. So the other maybe a solution will come to mind. It's basically the idea that what if player could have way to update the rule in some way. So it's Uniswap V4, which is not live yet, kind of building with the community, have this concept of like, what if I can create a pool, but I have KYC requirement or whatever kind of thing you can implement, and they use that with hooks, so you can publish your own smart contract that Uniswap will call and will change some of the rule of your pool. So now imagine that in a game, you could have said, okay, I have this planet, but now if I put a smart contract on it, maybe my planet produces more spaceships. Obviously, then you have the issue of balancing, like what if, I mean, someone will have it if you can just say, I produce that many spaceships. So you have kind of this issue, you need to put constraint into the system, and similarly, you need to put some constraint of what is possible. They have to make sure the AMM equation remain the same, for example. And so ultimately, you are constraining what is possible. And kind of, maybe the term, I don't think it's a perfect term, but compared to natural composability, I would call this kind of composability artificial composability, where you actually artificially constrain what is possible. Having said that, both are not mutually exclusive. And talking about natural composability, the idea is, first is a realization that, so far we have been discussing really heavily on the smart contract, the API that it enables, but of course the game and the world of the game is not the code. Like the world is actually composed of the code and the player and the interaction among them. And when you take this perspective, then you can see how you can change the rule without changing like the initial rule set. And so see the diagram, basically rule 0 is and the Genesis world, which is the big rectangle on the left, represent what you initially deploy, which is one smart contract maybe or multiple, which I call rule 0. And then you have P1, P2, P3, which are the player who plays that game. And the world is actually all of them together. So now anyone can make a new rule that inherits the state. Again, you can't change rule 0, so the rule 0 will remain there, but I can make a new rule that input take as input the state of rule 0, as well as a new form of input from maybe new players or existing players. So your P2 will play both game, and P4 will play only the new game, but he realized that because the state is dependent from the original game, then he has interest to communicate with P3 to make sure that he can get the best advantage. And similarly, it could be that the rule 1 enables things that were not possible before, that make player like P3 realizing that they need to pay attention to what is happening in rule 1. So yeah, it's kind of a summary. It's basically rule 1 reading from rule 0, and player of both basically can be affected. And so the interesting thing here is that there was no central coordination needed. Things can happen simultaneously. So someone could create another rule M, and all of these are social coordination, right? Because maybe rule 1 become popular, everybody uses it, but suddenly went into, like nobody is find interesting anymore, and suddenly another rule come into play. It's kind of very flexible, and you can see that in DeFi, or actually even going back to CryptoKitties, or like, so Kitty Race. So CryptoKitty was a game where you just have these genetics, and it only affects the visual aspect and some rarity aspect. So you could like breed CryptoKitty to create a new one, and they will have a different parameter. And someone creating a game, so again, this is a different company, they created another game, and they can't change the rule of CryptoKitty, but they say, actually, and the interesting thing, there was a trait, like some trait in CryptoKitty were not very valuable, because they were quite popular. Usually, like the rarity was what makes something valuable. But Kitty Ray decided to use something which was actually not valuable, and said this one will make you go fast. And so it affected the market price of the CryptoKitty adding that trait. So it's a very basic form of composability, but it shows that we can actually change things without changing the initial rule, just by the social coordination. And this is what Loot, I don't know if you heard of Loot, kind of, that's the whole idea behind it, is that I will create just basic thing and let people create project. And as mentioned to project your realm and the crypt, it's also something if you define, if you might know curve, and there was what we call the curve wars. Actually, I should link an article there. I can send you, there is an interesting article describing what's happening in DeFi. It's also another variant, a simpler variant is vampire attacks, where, like, let's say you have this marketplace that maybe don't have a token. Actually, there is this, like OpenSea, for example. I mean, vampire attack was another one. Was the first one was a sushi swap. So Uniswap had this thing, I think, I don't know, they didn't have a token, and SushiSwap created the clone of Uniswap, but they said they make it that whenever you use it, you are getting tokens. And so people like kind of shifted towards this, and then there was it. And Curve War is a far more complex scenario where people were fighting without modifying the original code, but by creating new things. And so what I am exploring actually now this with a new game called Stratagems. And I call it like natural composability because, like nature, it's always present. So you can't avoid it as a basically on-chain game designer, and no one controls it. So in Stratagem, so players are actual gods. The game starts with an NTC, and they can basically stake ETH onto the map, and it creates an island, and they choose a faction. And then there is kind of auto battle going on, where two different factions will attack each other, and then the one winning will capture the ETH that was put into it. And it's especially designed to be very simple, so actually there is only one action. It's putting a unit on the board. And what's happening is that we can expose different data points, which is the island owner, and the way it works is that the number of enemy island create tension. So the more enemy versus the friendly units you have around you decide whether your island is prosperous or is deteriorating. Here you see the fire, it's like it's deteriorating. And so you have this state, which we can basically that stratagem expose, and at some point the island dies when it reaches no more, so all the houses are burned, then it dies. And reversely there is a final state. I mean, all of this is still in work in progress, but basically it's to explore the land as a primitive. But so there is a very interesting article here mentioned in the QR. It's or Lars do say about land taxes, and basically if you think about land outside of all the government, the tax that exists is a blood tax, which is the fact that you have to fight with your life to keep your land. This is a basic form of tax that exists, and then you have government, and then you have several organizations. So here is kind of the blood tax. You can get land, but you have to fight for it. And now new layers so new games can be made. That's what I call it, natural composability. That's what we saw with the CryptoKitty, Kitty Race. But here we can imagine euros. So again, here I'm using my imagination because I didn't yet explore that in detail. But you can imagine, like, maybe you can put dragons on any island. So now this is the map. This map will evolve because of player playing the rule 0 game. But you are creating a new rule where any player can maybe put another stake, and they create a dragon, and the dragon will make eggs. And now the interesting thing is that the idea is that it produces eggs as long as the island is in the prosperous state. So now you need to make sure the players are making your island safe and secure, and so they might ask you in return some eggs as a contribution to the protection. So that's where it becomes a new kind of tax. Because it started as a blood tax, now we can explore different governing scenarios. And you can also create your own smart contracts that own the land below and kind of is shared by dragon owners to do different things. So then you have a two-way interaction between the two layers. So the way I see it here is that so you couldn't write, the rule one was defined as not writing back, but because any player can write back, so any smart contract can write into rule 0. Here I separate the two as having another smart contract that can do both, but another way to represent this is that you can have rules that can also write to rule 0. They are simply players. I mean, maybe I lost you here, but could maybe more detail. But and then we have this basic rule, and then we can even imagine more rules. Like maybe the dragon now. We are talking about another layer on top. We are dragon now because they are dragon. They are collecting gold, and so now gold is being automatically generated by that's a new rule. That say if you are a dragon owner, you are getting gold every whatever. But now maybe there is adventurer that can join the game and try to capture your gold. So interestingly, this new opportunity can change the dynamics also of player. Maybe a player of rule 0 might want to be an adventurer, and then suddenly he might want to change the relationship with the first player. So I don't know if it was clear enough, but basically that natural composability allows community to shape the future of the world beyond its initial immutable code, and there is no central planning needed, like no even books to define, nothing like that. It happens all permissionlessly. And I think my hope is that they will not do that. I mean, a lot of crypto space is all about reward, because we realize that incentives are a key component. I mentioned tax, I mentioned all this, because this is part of how this game will work. There is incentive to do that. But I hope player will go beyond that, because I believe there is an extrinsic reward as well to play this game and to build them. Yeah, thank you.